You're listening to the Mind Over Murder podcast.
My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the unsolved Colonial Parkway Murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group together with Kristin Dilley.
My name is Kristin Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victims advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas. Welcome to Mind Over Murder. I'm Kristin Dilley.
And I'm Bill Thomas.
We're back with part 2 of our discussion on online sleuthing and tipsters. This is what we would like you to know if you're planning on sending a tip about the Colonial Parkway murders or any case to law enforcement.
I'm looking forward to a fascinating conversation, part 2.
I think that one of the most interesting parts of our jobs, it really is a job, honestly. Like this ceased being a hobby a long time ago, and this is just, it's a job.
It's not a paying job.
I think it's really important that people understand that you don't get paid for this. Your investigation into your sister's case, this is not something that you get paid for, but it is practically your full-time job, that in this podcast.
To be fair, the podcast does have advertising on it, and
yes, it does.
We do receive a small bit of compensation for that.
Yes.
It's definitely not anything close to a full-time salary, and we're definitely not getting rich on our advertising. And we do appreciate the fact that everyone puts up with ads on podcasts. It comes with the territory, much like listening to the radio or watching TV.
When you got more involved officially in 2009, and when I got involved in 2015, fielding tips, I don't think is something that ever really crossed our minds as something that we were going to have to do.
No, but it did happen. I have made myself easy to find.
Yes,
and
that's how.
I have tried to respond to people when they've asked questions or made inquiries. And then, I don't know if I've said this on the podcast or not, I have the same AOL email address that I had since day one of the internet.
Wow.
It might not be my primary email address anymore, but I never changed it because I wanted to be easy to find. I have the same cell phone number that I had since I got my first cell phone all those many years ago. I deliberately did not change my number to make myself somewhat easy to find. So even as I moved around the country, I kept the same 917 cell phone number, which is a New York cell phone. For years, actually, I would sign almost everything I wrote on social media. I would write, which I still do often, Bill Thomas, brother of Kathy Thomas, Colonial Parkway Murders. And then I would often include my email address, typically the AOL address back then. And I did that very deliberately because I knew that if you have a name like William Thomas, you can be a little hard to find. All of that was a very conscious effort on my part to be easy to find. So in doing that, I knew that we would hear from a lot of people. I didn't realize we would get as many tips as we have. And then that flow of tips just seems to be increasing, if anything.
Do you remember what the first tip was for this case that you ever had to field?
Oh, gosh.
It was a long time ago, right?
A long time ago. I'd have to go look. I recently was looking at emails from 2009, 2010. It's probably in there somewhere.
By the way, some more behind the scenes stuff, guys. Bill takes notes on everything. I have never met such a prodigious note taker before. So if you end up having a conversation with Bill, like if you tip or whatever, he will write everything down in a notebook. 100%. Like I have seen the notebooks. I don't know how many notebooks you have, but Bill is a prodigious note taker. And in the first couple of years of the case, Bill, whenever you and I had a phone conversation, I had my trusty notebook and I would sit there and I would write stuff down. But then we started talking so much that it was like, this is ridiculous. Like I can't write down everything because I didn't always have my notebook with me.
Right.
A lot of times we started doing a daily phone call when I was on my way home from school.
And you're driving, right?
And I'm driving. So I couldn't take notes. And then it just got to the point where it was like, this is crazy. I cannot write down every single thing. But I've got about 2-3 years worth of phone call notes in a notebook that I keep very safely tucked away. Probably go in a safe deposit box or something. At some point, there may be information in there that could be very useful to someone sometime. But yeah, Bill is probably the most prodigious note taker of anyone I've ever met. And it is all right there in a notebook or in a computer file. And I know you said you've got to have thousands of emails at this point, right? Tens of thousands, maybe?
Well, I try not to save everything, but I do try to save the important ones. And then I've notebooks upon notebooks out in the guest house. There's a lot of stuff. There really is. But for instance, someone asked me for something today and I got to go find it. And they need a copy of an important document. I looked in my 2 Macs and I didn't see it. So I know I have a hard copy of it out in the files in the guest house. So I'll go take a look at it. I'm sure I can lay my hands on it. It becomes very challenging. I was having a contentious phone call with someone on Friday night regarding the case. And I actually ended up successfully finding emails from 2010, early 2010. I didn't want to share this email with him electronically, but I actually read him the email over the phone to make a point. It's amazing how much information you amass over time. The struggle is always to remember where it came from and when, and have to be a little bit careful that you're not blending information from one source versus another. Certainly with Kate Miles' book now, Trailed, coming out, there's a lot of focus on the Julie Williams-Lolly Winans murder in 1996. But I've done a fair amount of research on the case because it could potentially link to Kathy Thomas and Rebecca Dowski's murder. That's actually forced me to go back and reread a bunch of material on that case. It's always a struggle to stay on top of this information flow that's coming at you with new tips. And does that tie into something we might have heard about before? And the electronic stuff is very helpful. Someday I'd love to have an intern or a typist or someone type all of this stuff into the computer. I know that when we got heavily involved in the Colonial Parkway murders with the FBI starting in 2009, they were having their files digitized. And I'm jealous. I wish someone would digitize my files.
I mean, that's got to be a full-time job right there. That's crazy.
Someday.
We were talking last time about what makes for a good tip, whether it's sent to us via social media platform or email or phone call. And we talked about the importance of 2 things in particular. One is very specific information, specific actionable information, although actionable is not always possible. There's not always a person that can be questioned or DNA that can be obtained or records that can be looked up. But law enforcement, I think, would prefer that. And we also talked about the importance of credibility, both credible information coming to us from a source and also the credibility of ours that is on the line when we send things to the FBI. We wanted to continue that conversation by talking a little bit more about some of the things that tipsters should keep in mind if they're planning on sending information to us specifically or to any set of investigators about any murder case. Because I think what we're offering here doesn't just apply to our case. I imagine it would apply to most investigations that are unsolved and active that are looking for tips. Is that a pretty fair assessment?
I think that it is. Sometimes we get questions, and I appreciate the inquiry. Don't misunderstand me. People are asking questions that are so basic. They've got this thing called the Google machine, and you can use Google or any search engine and find a ton of information about the Colonial Parkway murders or any case. And we've gone to great lengths. For instance, we have colonialparkwaymurders.com, which is a website we operate, and the Mind Over Murder podcast.com website, which lists all of our episodes and has information about the podcast itself. And of course, you can go back and listen to any of our previous episodes. Specifically with the colonialparkwaymurders.com, we were extremely unhappy several years back when we'd been continually updating the Wikipedia page on the Colonial Parkway Murders. First of all, I had to convince them to change the name of the page from Colonial Parkway Killer, which we don't think is appropriate. Why we focused on killer and not the case, particularly since we don't know who the offender might be. We were very frustrated because we were providing continual updates to the Wikipedia page, and then they had the gall to take down all of this work that we'd done, saying that because Kristin is an advocate and I'm a family member, we're too close to the Colonial Parkway murders and that it wasn't appropriate. Someone actually had the nerve to say to me in an exchange with Wikipedia that we were promoting ourselves. This is way before Mind Over Murder. And I said, what do you mean promoting ourselves? In what way? I can think of a lot of other things I'd like to be known for rather than being the brother of a murder victim. My brothers and I are very proud to be Kathy Thomas's brothers. Promoting ourselves? It was crazy. So Wikipedia, in its ultimate arrogance, refused to put all of these links and all of this information that we provided, continually updating Wikipedia with new articles, new interviews, the television series, on, and they just took it all down in a very arbitrary way, and I appealed it, and then I just threw my hands up in the air. So that provided an impetus for us to try to provide a better information flow to colonialparkwaymurders.com, which we hope people will use as a research tool to find articles and read the case. There's a ton of links to television interviews. We also have a YouTube channel, and all of this is designed to build awareness of the case. One of the things I would say to someone, if they really are interested in learning more about the case or potentially providing information about the Colonial Parkway murders, is spend a little time on these resources and listen to these podcasts and watch some television interviews about the case, because you can understand a lot more about the history of this case just through a little bit of online research.
And it is really important that you do at least some basic research about the case, because the person that you may be sending a tip about may already be one of our, and again, I know I sound flip by saying this, but there's no better way to put it really. They may be a sort of a fan favorite suspect. We have a regular pool of names that come up whenever we get tips about the Colonial Parkway murder. Some of them are local. I will not be giving any names for this, by the way, but I think anybody who follows the case closely will know that we do have, for example, a local favorite suspect who came up any number of times because he was a local teacher. He was actually one of my teachers back when I was in high school. We have had local Virginia serial killers that have come up a number of times as fan favorite suspects. We've had Edward Edwards come up a number of times. We always have perennial Zodiac suggestions. Boy, that one has come up so often. It's really important that if you are planning on sending in a tip, send in something that new information is important. We would rather see new information rather than the 50th tip about, have you considered that the Zodiac may also be responsible for the Colonial Parkway murders? We've heard it. We heard it 49 times before you and suggested it.
And by the way, the FBI is not big on answering questions. As a matter of fact, they're terrible. But I think the idea that the Zodiac could have been involved in the Colonial Parkway murders is definitely something they've thought about. And it's funny, a guy has reached out to me recently, and he's done some good research. And he thinks potentially the Zodiac could be involved in the Colonial Parkway murders. And I'm not saying he's wrong. It's interesting stuff, and he's a smart guy. One of the things I challenged this tipster with was my observation: are you sure you're not just picking out the elements you like the best?
Yes.
In a very selective way, lining them up alongside what we know about the Colonial Parkway murders, but ignoring everything that doesn't quite fit in terms of what we know about the history of the Zodiac case. So I think there can be some bias. I'm not saying that has happened in this particular example, and I'm enjoying talking to this gentleman who came forward with the information. I think we all have to be careful. I actually have my own theories on the Colonial Parkway murders, but I could be completely wrong. Just because I think things are one way doesn't mean that I'm even close to being.
We are thrilled that Dr. Kathryn Ramsland will be joining us later in June to talk a little bit about online sleuthing and confirmation bias and the issues that come about when you get fixated on a theory to the exclusion of all other theories. She wrote a terrific article for Psychology Today about some of the issues that come with online sleuthing and getting a laser focus on one thing to the exclusion of all others. And we're thrilled that she's going to be joining us to talk about that. So this is definitely something that's going to come up in that regard as well. We do encourage people to join pro boards. I know you're a particular fan of the EAR GSK pro boards, and you do spend time over there answering questions.
Right. The EAR, which stands for the East Area Rapist Golden State Killer pro boards, cover far more than just the Golden State Killer case. And they have special sections on different cases they think are particularly important. So if you sign up for the EAR GSK Pro Boards, which are free, and create a profile. It's a place, by the way, that some people will use an avatar or an alias or whatever. You're not obligated to say your name's Kristin, Dilley, or Bill Top. My name happens to be very clear who I am. That conversation, which is ongoing in a special section on the Colonial Parkway murders, is actually quite interesting. Mostly, I see my role there as a person that answers questions and provides input or tries to help move the conversation forward. Not necessarily always about leading the conversation, but informing it. And there's some very smart people, some of whom I know personally, who participate in the conversations in the EAR GSK Pro Boards. That's one that I do try to look in on at least once a week, particularly to answer questions. You're listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll be right back after this word from our sponsors. We're back here at Mind Over Murder.
One of the other things that we also want to address that comes up quite often when we are dealing with written tips, as in things that come to us through social media. It goes to credibility, and I realize that it's going to sound pedantic because it's coming from the English teacher. But please hear me out on this one, everybody, and don't just dismiss it because this is what I do for a living. If you're sending a tip to us or to law enforcement or to the FBI, we are glad that you're taking the time to write it. It is a big step, but please make sure that whoever is reading your tip can take it seriously by making sure that it is written well. And again, I know that sounds like exactly what every high school English teacher on the planet would say, but let's explain why for a minute, because you and I have fielded any number of tips. When we say written, we don't mean sounds like it could be a best-selling novel. What we just mean by your tip needs to be coherent. We've received a number of tips, both recently and in the past, that unfortunately, despite our very best efforts, we cannot make head nor tails of because the writer could not make themselves understood. They rambled, or they wrote super duper long paragraphs that may or may not have included punctuation, so that we're reading a jumble of word salad sentences and going, I don't understand what this means. I'm thinking of some of the doozies that we've read that you and I have been on the phone together for hours trying to puzzle out and go, oh my God, do we send this to Jim Fitzgerald and let him have a crack at it? What do we do with this?
Yeah, I think we all have to remember, none of us are perfect writers, but spell check is your friend.
Yes.
Paragraphs, for the love of Mike, are also your friend.
Yes.
Sometimes we'll get these things and it's one long screed with no punctuation and it just goes on and on. And remember what I said in the last episode about sometimes law enforcement people who have a very tough job, they can be cynical. don't provide them with an excuse to say, next. I got a whole bunch of other stuff to do today, and reading this marathon, as you said, word salad paragraph, which just goes on for days and doesn't make any sense. You're turning your reader off before he or she has had a chance to even think about your tip in the Colonial Parkway Murders or any case. I've actually taken information that we've received and actually broken it down into paragraphs sometimes because I'm embarrassed, because I really want agent to look at this. They're not even going to be willing to look at it if it looks like an encyclopedia entry with no punctuation whatsoever and misspelled words. That sort of thing just makes a switch go off in your head that says, this isn't important. They didn't even take the time to run spell check or break this into paragraphs or add punctuation or whatever.
And of course, because I teach high schoolers, my high school students constantly push back at me on this. Miss Dilley, language is constantly evolving. Miss Dilley, nobody cares about spelling anymore.
Yes,
Miss Dilley, doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if I use text speak. Everybody knows what OMG is anyway. It's fine. And I keep telling them again, guys, this all goes to credibility. You have to look like you care about what you're writing, and you have to look like you are a reasonably well-educated human being who is capable of making their thoughts known and understood in a coherent fashion. If I can't read it, I tell my kids all the time, if I can't read your paper, either handwriting or coherency, I can't grade your paper. As you just said, a law enforcement person who only has X number of time during the day, if they can't read and understand your tip, they're not going to do anything with it. They have to be able to look at it and understand what you're saying round one. The number of times that Bill and I have gotten on the phone together and said, okay, I'm looking at the first paragraph here, but there's 6 names. Which name is our suspect? Have you been able to figure it out? There's one tip. This person keeps updating the tip every couple of months. I think this was also last weekend, the same time that I called you about the guy that we had to ban. I said, oh, X just updated their tip again. 2 in the morning.
Which is never a good sign.
Yes, it was 2 in the morning, and they had written something about diesel fuel, I think it was. But they'd added like 2 other names to their potential list of people who were involved. And I was reading over everything this person had ever written, and I'm like, I still don't know who they're blaming. I have no idea.
Yeah, I went back and reread that stuff too. And could you get to the point if you think so-and-so is involved in the Colonial Parkway murders? That's perfectly righteous. Make that point. You're throwing in more and more information, and some of this starts to feel like drunk texting at 2:00 in the morning. Oh yeah, let me add more information about diesel fuel. It's just not helpful. As the son of an alcoholic, I am very put off when people are drunk dialing or drunk texting or whatever, and they're drunk or high or whatever, and they think, I'm going to start writing about the Colonial Parkway murders. And it's please, wait till you're sober and then tell us whatever it is you have got to tell us. It's not that we don't want to hear from you, and I'm certainly not going to tell people what time of day or night they're going to write to us, but come on, show a little judgment, because it all goes to credibility, like we talked about in the last episode. You have to appear credible to us, and then we have to turn around and put our personal credibility on the line that we think this is at least worth law enforcement reading and absorbing, not to mention perhaps taking additional action steps to find out if there's something here. So you've got to take your best shot at this. Paragraphs are your friend. It won't kill you to break your thoughts down into small bite-sized chunks that actually might mean something to someone that hasn't heard this information.
And we don't mean to sound flip or cynical or any of what we may sound like when we're saying things like this. We don't sound like we're blowing people off who are sending in tips. We have a responsibility as the people who are getting this information to pass it on to law enforcement in its best form. And we have to be able to understand what you want us to get across. Otherwise, the tip is going to be worthless to us and to law enforcement. I couldn't even come up with an estimate of how many tips that we've fielded over the years.
It's got to
but
be.
it feels like a lot.
It's got to be in the hundreds, certainly.
It really does have to be. After a while, I think credibility is going to be the watchword here. In terms of credibility, we definitely have a lot of it in that we have fielded so many. Only a tiny percentage of what we get, we can send to the FBI, and an even smaller percentage of that gets followed up on. Bill, of the number of tips that we've sent in, how many would you say the FBI has really taken the time to act on? Understanding that they don't tell us everything.
I think everything we've sent them, they've taken the time to read and absorb. My sense in the last few weeks, interestingly, is that they seem to be taking significantly more action than they ever have before. I can't exactly put my finger on why. I can't tell if it's Kate Miles' new book, Trailed, which is shining a bright spotlight on the Julie Williams-Lolly Winans murder in 1996. I can't tell if it's this podcast or other interviews that we've done. But there's something going on. I think it's a good thing. And it seems to involve significant forward progress in both the Shenandoah murders and the Colonial Parkway murders. And I think that's a good thing. Exactly how that's going to play out, I'm not quite certain.
But I would say that probably of the tips that we have sent, it really is just a tiny fraction. So if you consider the amount of input that we get and the amount of output that we can send forward, we get a lot, we wade through a lot. And the best way to ensure that we're going to be able to make the most use of your tip is to make sure that it is specific, actionable if possible, credible, and well-written. I'm not just saying it because I'm the English teacher. I hope that we've made it very clear at this point how important it is that anything that you send us, and by the way, we read everything that people send us. If you take the time to send it, we will read it.
Right.
We promise.
Yeah, without question.
Yeah. Sometimes we can make heads or tails of it. Sometimes we can't. Sometimes we can forward it to the FBI. Sometimes we can't. Anything that comes to us via any platform, we will read it. We will give it due consideration. Some we just take more seriously than others. And a lot of times that's because of the information that's given or the way that it's written or both.
At the same time, when someone sends us an email or other form of communication and says, was Fred Atwell ever looked at as being involved in the Colonial Parkway murders? The late Fred Atwell, disgraced former Gloucester County deputy sheriff. A quick read of the history of the Colonial Parkway murders will show you dozens of articles that indicate that Atwell had inserted himself into the Colonial Parkway murders and was very involved in the case and was later charged with fraud and armed robbery and ended up dying in jail a few years ago. A tip like that, there's no new information there. In other words, asking, was Fred Atwell ever looked at? Quick online research would tell you, oh yeah, Fred Atwell was definitely looked at. Was Fred Atwell eliminated as a suspect in the Colonial Parkway murders? Not to my knowledge. And I talked to the man dozens of times during the 2009 to 2012 timeframe. Sometimes we talk as often as more than once a day. I'm not sure, for example, that he had anything to do with the Colonial Parkway murders. He definitely did insert himself into the case. But unless someone with new information, and I guess I should underline new information, has something to say, just saying they should look at Fred Atwell doesn't really get us anywhere because Fred Atwell has been looked at. He may still be on a list of 150 persons of interest in the Colonial Parkway murders, but unless you've got something new, I don't think there's anything for us to take to the FBI regarding Atwell or any other suspect you might name.
And we do want to underline that, again, we will read anything that anyone sends to us, but we will not pass everything on to the FBI for reasons that we underlined in our previous episode. Our credibility is on the line. I think, Bill, we were talking one day and I said, I feel like we only get so many turns in the batter's box
I worry
with the
about
FBI.
that.
And it really does feel that way. It feels like there's only so many times that we can send something to them before they go, okay, you two, sit down. Your turn is over. Occasionally, we've had people get insistent and go, but the FBI hasn't contacted me yet. Didn't you send this? Why haven't they said anything to me? We can't help if the FBI is going to contact you or not. That is way out of our jurisdiction. But also, we just can't send everything to the FBI.
Now, if it is credible, we will pass it on because, as I said, we have no way of knowing if something might mean something significant to one of our investigators.
Sure.
So we're not trying to block information flow to those investigators because they might say, whoa, hang on for a second. That information we received from Kristin and Bill regarding person XYZ or whatever, that might mean something to them in the investigation as they move forward. And it might fill in a blank for something that they've been trying to find, like a missing puzzle piece for some time. We have no way of knowing that. But you've got to be able to give us something that is new information or your perspective on something that hasn't been made available before. This is where I get frustrated when people say Ed Edwards committed the Colonial Parkway murders. And I've read the book on Ed Edwards, and I'm sorry, they've got him committing every major crime from the Lindbergh baby on forward. This is craziness. They've got him traveling all over the country and killing all of these people, and they don't seem to have proven any of it. And I've said to other tipsters and other people, including some private investigators, I remember having an argument with one particular PI where I said, focus on what you can prove. This PI was insisting that her particular favorite person of interest was not only responsible for the Colonial Parkway murders, and she was able to actually put him in Virginia at the time of Kathy and Becky's death. And at other times, at different times when the Colonial Parkway murders, sad events had taken place. But at the same time, she was blaming him for dozens of murders up and down the East Coast. And I said, focus on what you can prove. I remember following up on some information she'd given me. She referenced some law enforcement agencies. I called those law enforcement agencies up and introduced myself. When I managed to get return calls, you could tell that those officers, those investigators, were extremely skeptical of this fellow Bill Thomas because I was referencing a particular PI and her favorite suspects. And they were like, oh, please. She didn't have any credibility. Therefore, when I called to follow up, to talk about potential tie-ins to the Colonial Parkway murders, I didn't have any credibility either. If anything, I was starting in negative numbers.
So we would say that if you're planning on sending in a tip to us or law enforcement, I'm a teacher. I like to do takeaways. So we're going to do 4 takeaways here for anyone who is interested in sending in a tip to anyone about anything. Tip number 1, make sure that your tip is specific and contains as much information as possible so that law enforcement can act on it if needed. Number 2, make sure your tip is coherent, makes sense, and is well phrased so that there is no mix-up with meaning. If law enforcement doesn't know what to look for, they cannot act on your information. Number 3, make sure you're providing information that can be verified, either by law enforcement or by any investigator who may be looking into your tip. If you have corroborating evidence like emails or newspaper clippings or journal entries, have all your information in one place and readily available in case law enforcement asks for it. And finally, number 4, make sure that your tip is grounded in solid fact or personal experience. It should not be hearsay, gossip, scuttlebutt, anything that cannot be proved, and that does include information from psychics that would not hold up in court. Anything that I've missed, Bill, that you want to add for the folks at home?
No, I think it's a great list. I hope we don't sound like we're anything less but appreciative of the fact that people reach out to us and are trying to help. We get it. We're very interested in people continuing to reach out to us regarding the Colonial Parkway murders or other cases for that matter. We will help in any way that we can, but I think it's extremely important to approach things in the way that you've just outlined, Kristin, because otherwise the tip's not going to be taken seriously and it's certainly not going to be acted upon by law enforcement.
I just feel like we want to end on this note. We just can't stress enough how appreciative we are of how supportive everybody is. Everybody who has come to CrimeCon to talk to us and extend support for the podcast or condolences for Bill about his connection to the case. Everybody has been so supportive and so kind. We appreciate that you guys are supportive of us, and we appreciate any time that you want to reach out and give us feedback or tips or anything along those lines. Please do not think that we don't want to hear from you. We want to hear from you, absolutely, positively. But if you are planning on sending something to law enforcement, that is a huge step. And it's really important that you follow those guidelines so that you are taken seriously moving forward. Thank you, everybody, so much for all the support that you have given us, both in the past and going forward into the future. That's going to do it for this episode of Mind Over Murder. We'll see you next time.
Mind Over Murder is a production of Absolute Zero and Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawl Space Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder.